that I have a short PowerPoint that summarizes the points that I'll be making. But I think it might help if I just said a little bit about how I came to ask the questions that this paper attempts to address, because it's been a matter of long gestation. My work has tended to focus on issues of justice in deeply diverse contexts. Initially, people who are situated differently with respect to the productive process, labor law was the area in which I did my graduate work. But since then, linguistically divided societies, situations of religious diversity, and as Kat indicated, a lot of work on indigenous, non-indigenous reconciliation and interaction. And one of the things that has really struck me, especially in the context of indigenous reconciliation, is how inadequate our normative tools tend to be. The concepts that we tend to use, the concepts that the law tend to use, tend to be intrinsically kind of all or nothing, right? Who owns the land? One party owns it, the other party doesn't, right? Who owns sovereignty? One party has sovereignty, the other party doesn't. And that seems out of sync with the approaches that all parties, or substantially all parties, consider has to be the ground of a solution. Some form of sharing of the territory, some form of sharing of governmental control over the territory. But although everybody of goodwill has a sense that the solutions have to involve some kind of sharing, we have very few tools for guiding us as to what those shares might be. What between zero and complete authority, where those shares ought to fall. And that creates challenges for the resolution of these arguments. Of course, there are many reasons why solutions are resisted that have nothing to do with arguments of justice. But when one gets to the arguments of justice, one has the challenge of how to keep the variety of normative considerations in play simultaneously, which in part also creates a increasing room for the bad faith arguments to operate. How can one then acknowledge the justice of indigenous claims and at the same time realize and affirm the legitimacy of non-indigenous societies? How do those two things work together? And in fact, a lot of arguments for indigenous rights or against indigenous rights seem often to come down to little more than choosing sides. And the focus of this argument then is how one can develop tools for navigating in that space between. The arguments will really be focusing on that context, working off of that context, which I'll state quite dramatically. Though to be clear, I actually think that a lot of the tools apply in less dramatic contexts, and that the kind of shift that you'll see in the presentation from concerns with substantive questions of justice to the processes by which we can address those challenges, address those questions, that shift is one that is appropriate in many other contexts of moral disagreement. So although the argument will be developed in an area where those challenges are most forcefully present, I think the implications flow well beyond it. Well, those are the preliminaries, and I'll just share the screen so that I can take you through the essence of the argument. Can everybody see that? Whoop. No, they can't. Okay, just one sec. Great. How's that work? Can everybody see? Perfect. Okay, great. So the setup of the argument is this. We tend to approach questions of justice as though the essence of our task is to identify what justice demands in the situation and then determine what we need in order to realize that conception of justice. But what if the set of just solutions is empty? What do we do then? What if, in other words, we cannot see a way to achieve justice adequately for one party, except in a manner that in fact appears to do an injustice to another of the parties? So we have trouble seeing how we can deal with the challenges of justice at all adequately without causing other unjustified outcomes. And the example that, as I mentioned, really lies at the foundation of this is the question of Indigenous dispossession. The dispossession of Indigenous peoples occurred in circumstances that on virtually any view were unjust. And the injurious consequences of that dispossession continue to this day. In fact, in many times in popular argument, the Indigenous dispossession is treated as though it occurred a very long time ago, where in many cases, the actual effectual dispossession is occurring much more recently in the present day. We treat it as though dispossession occurred at the time when colonists first arrived on the continent, but for many Indigenous peoples, dispossession is occurring right now when they're moved off of their contemporary territories because, for example, of the development of a hydroelectric dam. And yet, there are people, but even though one realizes the injustice of Indigenous dispossession, there are people now on the territory who did not participate directly in that dispossession, though we certainly benefit from that dispossession, who have nowhere else to go and who've built their entire lives and did their whole societies on those lands. And so one cannot fully reverse the dispossession of Indigenous peoples without doing harm to those people. On what justification? And so I'd argue in circumstances like this, the considerations of justice are tragically aligned. It's difficult to perceive how one can achieve adequate justice for one party without committing an injustice against another. Now, there is a common approach to dealing with these kinds of issues. One that's associated, I guess, most prominently with the work of Fisher and Urey in their book, Getting to Yes, where the suggestion is that given that conflict over conceptions of rights, we should bracket the arguments of justice, bracket the arguments based on rights, and instead focus on interests. That is not the approach that I'll be taking in this argument. That approach appears to me to be misconceived. Probably the most important reason is that today's interests are constituted by past actions. They're constituted materially in the current condition of the relations between the communities, ideationally, in the norms that the parties recognize and live by. It's true legally that one can't talk about interests without assuming control over some entitlements, some resources that fall within the current control of participants. And yet it's precisely those foundational allocations that are in issue in Indigenous dispossession. So past wrongs have an afterlife in the present. And it's difficult even to see how one might speak coherently about interests in a way that does not at least presume some apportionment of entitlements. One could see that, for example, in thinking about who is in the position of a petitioner, who is in the case of in the position of a defender, who has the onus to make their case, who simply is resisting the case. One of our Indigenous graduate students kind of presented that most forcefully in an argument in relation to the recognition of Indigenous peoples, saying, listen, in relations between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state, the essential question is not whether the Canadian state will recognize Indigenous peoples. It's whether Indigenous peoples will recognize the legitimacy of the Canadian state. But there is one thing that that underpins the approach that Fisher and Uri are taking that is worth considering. And that is what you see them doing in their book is trying to open up space for compromise, trying to open up space in which the language is not all or nothing, that there can be some recognition of all parties' positions. That instinct, I think, is right, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't presume that one can sideline questions of justice, but that engages with those issues in a way that is consistent with an aspiration to normative judgment, to right conduct that is implicitly in the language of justice. We need to find a way to make progress in questions of justice, even if we have difficulty envisaging exactly what a fully just solution might entail. And that's the aspiration that comes here in the strategies of justice. So what are those strategies? So this will be a slide that will summarize much of the discussion that I will be presenting. And divide I divide the kind of strategies of justice into two categories: Carpenter's justice, and I'll describe how that category gets that title in a moment, and transformative justice. Carpenter's justice is about what justice looks like, what are the strategies that it can achieve a semblance of justice, taking as the foundation something like our current normative understandings, concepts, commitments. Transformative justice, on the other hand, imagines the possibility of substantially recasting those normative understandings, those normative concepts, those normative commitments, in a way that at least transforms the conflicts, perhaps even holds out the hope of an eventual resolution. So the first category focuses on justice, one might say, in the near term, how one can make progress on issues of justice and injustice, given the current distribution of normative concepts and commitments. Transformative justice thinks about the possibility of recasting our relations so substantially that we can imagine different ways of living together in the right way. Now, to be clear, I don't see these two things as being pursued sequentially. Indeed, I think that one wants to work on both, on justice in the near term and justice, a more ambitious justice for the future simultaneously. But one does need both, if for no other reason than that the horizon of transformative justice is one that is continually before us, continually beyond what we can currently achieve. So we need both strategies, both sets of strategies, and we need to be pursuing them simultaneously. And indeed, after going through some of the strategies, I'll then talk about the distinctive modes of interaction that supports those strategies. And those distinctive modes of interaction really, I think, are conducive to both sets of strategies. So what are the strategies? So here are the ones that I'll address now with respect to Carpenter's justice. First, where the heck does that title come from? So this is the image that lies at the foundation of that title. Say you have a house, the walls of which are not square. An old house, you're renovating it. You want to install a crown molding in that room. Crown molding is the molding that goes along the top of the wall where it meets the ceiling. And one can imagine two clear standards of how to mount that molding. One, you could take your level, inscribe a level line on the wall, and install the crown molding in relation to that line. Alternatively, you can follow the line of the ceiling, the sloping ceiling, and you can install the molding in a way that follows that line. But any carpenter worth their salt will not choose either of those standards. Instead, they'll pick a line that lies in between those two, and that is justified really in relation to both simultaneously, even though both standards are themselves incompatible. And when a carpenter does that, note that what they're engaging in is the equivalent of a normative decision. They're faced with two alternative standards of proper carpentry, and they pick one that does not align, that does not have independent justification, but derives its legitimacy by its relationship to both of the other incompatible standards. And so the argument is that that is the form of justice that is relevant in these kinds of circumstances. Even if one can't see an independently justifiable resolution of the claims of justice that are being made, the appropriate line is one that works off of the competing standards, that keeps them both in play that doesn't choose between them, but relates to those two standards. One that recognizes, if you will, the plural conceptions of justice and attempts to find a line that relates acceptably, relates well to both. So one of the ways of continuing to talk about justice, even in the place of incompatible arguments, is to imagine oneself as engaged in finding a societal solution that stands in appropriate relationship to both of the competing standards. A second strategy. Often, well, I guess the kind of initial thing isn't saying that one should respond to the demands of injustice. The same thing as saying that one should achieve justice. And that, I think, is not right. That our conceptions of justice tend to be singular, comprehensive, totalizing. They aspire to that singularity and to that comprehensive character. But because of that ambition, precisely because of that ambition, they are prone to conflict with contrasting conceptions of justice. There is more potential for common ground if, instead of asking, how can everything be put right, one focuses instead on what appear to be situations of injustice, and to alleviate, improve, remedy those particular circumstances. One can often find that one has more, that those responses to injustice can often achieve greater commonality of support than a single comprehensive vision can do. Responses to injustice can be justified by a varying array of conceptions of what right conduct would consist of. And in fact, I'd argue that responding to the demands of injustice is in fact closer to individual citizens' moral experience. Their judgments of justice and injustice tend to be more situational. They tend to be focused on being able to enter into the story of the person who is claiming a situation of injustice, and to realize that even if they can't imagine how everything could be put right, they can see that that situation is wrong. And that can be a motive for action. Even if a perfect resolution to the entirety of the issue seems to be beyond one's grasp. And in fact, many of you will realize that those kinds of arguments, this kind of shift from a focus on comprehensive conceptions of justice to responding to particular demands of injustice, is an approach that has been taken in recent work of Amartya Sen, of Kwame Anthony Appiah, and so on. Okay, a third strategy is a disaggregation of general questions of justice into specific questions of justice. Very often, when one confronts arguments with respect to indigenous dispossession that suggest that there's little alternative but kind of moral paralysis, it's because the question is posed at a very high level of generality. In fact, a high level of generality that I myself used in setting up the problem. Whether indigenous people are to have the land or non-indigenous people are to have the land. Often progress can be made by descending from that realm of high abstraction and to dealing with more specific questions. And in doing so, one can alleviate particularly egregious situations of injustice, even if a total solution lies, at least for now, beyond our grasp. And then the fourth strategy is what I refer to as agreeing to disagree. Again, often as theorists, we seek to find what we consider to be the just solution, but tolerating the continued existence of non-agreement over those normative standards, allowing for normative diversity to continue to exist, can often be, in practical terms, an effective strategy and one that allows us to continue to pursue questions of justice, even when we can't yet see a complete resolution. So those are examples of approaches to issues of justice and injustice. If we take the current distribution of our normative commitments essentially as given, how we can achieve a measure of justice in the here and now. But what about our ability to imagine, our ability to achieve a transformation of our relations that allow us to see quite different ways of relating? And I should say that one of the things that you'll see that underpins all of the strategies that I'm about to put on the screen is that conceptions of justice aren't ahistorical. They're embodied in, as Wittgenstein would say, forms of life, that they that our moral imaginations exist within time. And so what these strategies talk about is how we can begin to experiment with the transformation of our forms in life in a way that may reveal quite different ways of conceiving of our normative relations and constructing our institutions. So the first of them is to foster the knowledge and experience of plural forms of social organization, really as a spur to one's imagination about how one might live differently. The ability to experiment with other ways of conceiving of social life, other ways of relating to the land, for example, other ways of seeing ourselves in relation to the ecological environment that can transform our conceptions of property and perhaps open up quite different ways of our relations with others. The sixth strategy, practically taking steps to develop solidarity, to make common cause. So even if we can't imagine yet what a just reconstruction of our relations might look like, beginning to work on common projects that allow us to interact with others and develop a better understanding of others, and perhaps transform on a small scale our relations in a way that might hold promise for larger scale transformations, are valuable. And note what you see here, the implications for the topic of this seminar series. That argumentation is not seen as something that is purely intellectual, but something that is interdependent with our practical modes of interrelationship, our practical modes of living together. Part of that developing of solidarity ought to be pursuing forms of justice that may not address the central questions that divide us, but that are valued by both and indeed empower parties. Pursuit of economic equality, for example, in the case of Indigenous peoples, which doesn't of itself address the issues of the recognition of different forms of governance, the recognition of Indigenous entitlements to the land, but that nevertheless empower and build solidarity are valuable. And I guess the eighth is jurisdictional justice. One of the things that you see animating this presentation is one of the challenges of justice in these circumstances is the different moral, the different normative conceptual universes that the peoples are deploying. And just as one under Carpenter's justice might find there's more scope for agreeing to disagree than one other thing, as one begins to transform, allowing for the existence of different jurisdictions for where those different conceptions of justice might operate is a crucial dimension of the outcome, an acceptable outcome. Well, there's obviously much more to be said about any of these strategies, and I'll look forward to your comments on or questions about any of those or objections. Let me though just move to the last slide, which is about distinctive modes of interaction that support these strategies. So one of them is to emphasize the importance of sustained interaction, of not rushing to judgment, not reaching too quickly for what one takes to be the best of the solutions, allowing space for learning and for growth and understanding. And let me tell a story that I think for me was revelatory. Quite a few years ago now, I was involved in a research group on Indigenous, non-Indigenous reconciliation that involved a large number of Indigenous scholars as well as non-Indigenous scholars, and the group was structured as a dialogue. And I remember we had a graduate student activity, which was inspired by the work of Augusto Boal, the theater of the oppressed, where one engages in kind of set piece interactions as ways of imagining how one should understand conflict, how one might resolve them. And one of these exercises involved two of the participants arranging their bodies in a way that embodied some form of conflict. And then the rest of us, the rest of the participants, intervening to move their bodies in order to resolve the conflict. And the exercise worked itself out as expected. And then in the debrief at the end, one comment remains with me to this day. One of our graduate students, a Cree graduate student, Alison Dubois. And she said this. She said, when we did this, people moved in to resolve the conflict. But I would have liked us to have not moved in so quickly to achieve a resolution. I would have liked us to have sat with the conflict for some time, to have absorbed its implications, understood before moving. And that, I think, is immensely wise. As theorists, we always, as actors, as citizens, we yearn for a resolution. But it may be that, in fact, we need to make sure we allow the conflict itself to soak in. Second, truth-telling. Familiar from the transitional justice literature, and many of you may have noticed some affinities between what I've been talking about in the transitional justice literature. How investigation and acknowledgement is important, even especially if full redress is, at least for the moment, unachievable. And if you think about it, that's one thing that was implicit in Alison's comment as well. That one of the reasons for sitting with the conflict, sitting with the loss, sitting with the tragedy, is that if it cannot be completely reversed, it is at least important that we see what is given up, being given up. We see what is not being achieved. That's one of the huge functions of truth-telling. The third is an emphasis on co-determination. Some of you in the context of Carpenter's justice my discussion of Carpenter's justice may have asked yourself, who is the carpenter? And of course, that's a kind of issue. And our tendency as theorists is to say, well, of course we are. We'll tell you how to sort it out. Or in the legal arena, we'll take it to a court and we'll have it adjudicated in court. Seems pretty clear, given the kind of structure of the strategies that you've seen to this point, that any reliance on a single decision maker is problematic. And that co-determination is in fact the best way to achieve that Carpenter's line. And then the fourth is a difficult one. The vulnerability that comes with surrendering even provisionally or acknowledging that total justice will not be achieved in the interests of living together. Many of you will know Danielle Allen's work, Talking to Strangers. And she talks in quite challenging fashion about the importance of sacrifice in winning through to some better relationship. A kind of leap of faith, a willingness, a vulnerability. One might even say an attempt to prefigure the change before the change occurs. And that, too, it seems to me, is one of the dispositions that supports the kinds of strategies that you've seen in this presentation. So that's the argument, and I look forward very much to your comments.